Welcome to the 52-week Bible Challenge. This week is week 4. We're on Genesis 12, which is the call of Abraham. I'm Kelly.
And I'm Donovan. We get to see today one of the fathers of the faith. We're going to see some of God's promises, and we're going to see God's promises in action. We're going to see his protection and blessing in unusual circumstances. And so we're starting to look at the life of Abram, or Abraham. And one of the things that you'll probably hear us use the name interchangeably, and that's because when we first are introduced to Abram, he is known as Abram. He's not known as Abraham. It's not until later that God changes his name from Abram to Abraham and changes his wife's name from Sarai to Sarah. So we'll use the name interchangeably, but ultimately Abram becomes Abraham, and we see him. We're first introduced to him towards the end of chapter 11, and he starts out in the land of Ur of the Chaldeans. This is modern day Iraq today. It's also what ultimately becomes Babylon. So when you hear Babylon and Ur of the Chaldeans and Iraq, they're all the same geological place, just different points in time and history. So he starts out in the land of Ur, and God gives him this call to go leave his family. And we see this call here in Genesis 12:1. The Lord says to Abram, "Go from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing." And we see this. This is a command. This is a command to Abram, and it comes with some faith. But with that faith comes a promise. So we see that Abram has to leave everything he knows, everyone he loves, everything that's kind of comfortable, and go someplace. And the Lord's not telling him where he's going to go. He doesn't say, go to the land of Canaan, go to Egypt, go. He just says, go from your land, leave where you're at, go someplace else. And it's in the going that God will eventually show him where he's to go and what's going to happen in more detail as he goes. So there's a lot of trust that has to happen in this passage. In verse 3, God goes on and says, "I will bless those who bless you. I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." God promises blessings to Abraham and his descendants. That promise carries on through all time. This is not a promise with an expiration date on it. In fact, what we know today that Abram didn't see at this time is that we know that this promise, the part that says all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you, is ultimately pointing to Jesus Christ and his birth, his ministry, his death, burial, resurrection. All of that is pointing to that, because it's through Christ's sacrifice and through his resurrection that every person on earth is blessed.
Woohoo!
Yeah,
That's good news.
Yeah, and I think you had some more to add to that.
Scholars have made lists about the countries that have cursed the nation or the people of Israel and how it went bad for those countries afterward. And this is throughout history. And then lists of the nations that are countries that have treated Israel or its people well, have blessed them, and how it went well for those countries. So it's really neat to see throughout thousands of years of history this blessing play out.
Yeah, and there's a lot of you can see God's hand in the nation of Israel. I mean, what nation has ceased to exist for hundreds and hundreds of years? I mean, from 70 AD until 1948, there wasn't a nation of Israel. The Romans dispersed them, and they were scattered throughout Europe and Africa and Asia, and it wasn't, and even as far as North America, really all over the world, I guess. Yeah. And in 1948, after World War II, after a horrible Holocaust, not got to mention that, but God moved, and the United Nations said, "Hey, we need to find these people a place," and the nation of Israel was born again to this day. So we see God's promises echoing throughout time, even though it may seem in a moment that, maybe God's promises isn't real or it isn't fulfilled. It's like, nope, God comes through. When he says a promise, it's going to stick. So then we go on and we see Abram leaves. He obeys. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. So he's not a spring chicken. He's not just a young 20-year-old who's leaving his house to start a new life. Abram's already lived a full and rich life with his family. He has It says in verse 5, he takes his wife and a nephew and possessions. So he had possessions, he had wealth, he had servants and tents and animals. But he leaves. He does what the Lord tells him to do. But we see that Lot goes with him, and Lot is his nephew. We know that Lot's father died when Lot was younger, so Abram probably acted as like a surrogate father, or just that the uncle that helped raise him. So there's probably a close bond there, but ultimately, God said to leave his family behind, and Lot decides to go with him, and Abraham doesn't say no. And so this is kind of a little bit of partial obedience. And we know from the rest of the story, if you read on in the other chapters, that Lot causes some problems for Abram and gets into some trouble of his own. The cool thing, though, is that Lot is still counted as among the righteous. Like, yes, if you read in Hebrews 11, which will be one of our chapters we read in the future, that Lot is counted in the hall of faith, the hall of the ones who believed God and were righteous. So Lot is righteous, and he receives that label and that blessing of believing God, but he makes some poor choices and it doesn't go well for him. And so we see that. So there's some partial obedience there, but that doesn't affect God's promise to Abram. In fact, God's promises are not dependent upon Abram's obedience. Abram's obedience shows that he has faith in God, but even when it maybe appears like, well, is he really obeying, or is he doing everything he's supposed to do? Like, God's promises don't waver. God's promises stick even through those times.
That is good news as well.
That is very good news. One of the things that's interesting here is that we know that this command to leave his people actually happens before his father dies, before he goes to Haran. And we know this because there's a Stephen who's one of the disciples of Jesus who ends up being martyred in the book of Acts. He's given a sermon, and he says this in Acts 7, 2-4. He says, "Brothers and fathers," he replied, "listen, the God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia," which is another word for the land of Ur, "before he settled in Haran, and he said to him, 'Leave your country and relatives and come to the land that I will show you.' Then he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. From there, after his father died, God had him move to this land in which you are now living." And so we know that Abram received this call. So again, we don't know exactly, like, was it partial obedience, or really did God say just kind of hang out in Haran until your father dies? There's not really much there that says what happened in between that, but at some point he goes and he hangs out in Haran for a while until his father dies, and then from that point he goes on and moves on and leaves. So he doesn't really leave his father's house because his father died. I mean, he does in the sense that if he had any, there were brothers and relatives that they left, but he it's that he did it, but he didn't do it immediately, at least not at this point. So we see a journey, and we'll see that in this week, and then in our next week's chapter, as we're looking at another part of Abram's life, that there's this journey that Abraham goes on from believing God, but maybe not fully engaging in 100% immediate obedience all the time, to 100% faith in God. So then we move on to verse 7, and the Lord appears to Abram and says, "To your offspring I will give this land." So I guess we skipped over 6, but he's traveled, he's reached the land of Canaan, which is modern day Israel, but at the time it's called the land of Canaan. And the Lord appears to him and says, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to them. And then also in verse 8, he talks about going on to Bethel and Ai, also places in the modern day land of Israel. And he built an altar to the Lord there, and he called on the name of the Lord. And I like this because we see this is the second and third altars that we see in the Bible. So the last one we saw was in when we read the passage about Noah, and he comes off the ark and he builds an altar. And now we see Abram, he's being given a promise, been told a promise from God, and then goes to another place and he builds these altars. And what's cool about altars is that they are, in this place, they're made of earth or stone that hasn't been altered. They're just, but they're a place where you're remembering that you've had a place of interaction with God. Oftentimes sacrifices are made there, or there's, but it's a place of interaction, a place of intimacy with God, and it's a place of remembrance. So for every time Abram would go by this altar or near this altar, or even people who weren't Abram would see it, they would know, hey, something happened here, that something somebody had an interaction with God here. And that's what's cool about altars. So we see that here. There's Abram builds 4 of them through his life. This is his first and second altar that he builds. And there's an exchange. These are exchanges. And so he's meeting with God, and God is giving him a promise that Abram's going to hold on to for the rest of his life.
The life application is there something in your life or in our lives that we need to let die before we are in full, complete obedience? Is there something keeping you from completely obeying God? Not saying we want a relative to die, of course, but these would be things like maybe it's our pride or our status in a certain job we don't want to let go of so that we can move on to the next thing, or just things like that. Is there something in your life that has to die or be let go of before you act out in full obedience? And the beautiful thing is that, and we've said it, but I can't get over it, how good and faithful the Lord is, even when we're not. Because as we see through these chapters in Genesis, Abraham isn't perfect, but the Lord is, and the Lord is forgiving, and he's long suffering, and it's so good. And again, I love how he builds altars, and those are his special places of time to get together with the Lord, and he calls on him, he worships him, he hears from him there. So it's like, what area is that in our own lives? Do we have a place in the house, right? I go every morning, I sit in this chair, or, it's good to have a place because that reminds you, this is my God place right here.
Yeah. Well, and what's cool is that it's not one place.
Yeah.
He didn't go back to the first altar that he built to meet with God every time. God spoke to him in other places. Yeah. But it is a place of remembrance, and places are important. They're important to God, and you'll see, one maybe Bible challenge that you could take from this is look up some of these places, these names that you see in the scriptures, and see what happens at these places later in the Bible. That's a great kind of side quest to go on as we do this 52-week challenge. When you see a Bible name, like a name of a place, look it up, see what happened there in history, because sometimes there's a story to be told at the place, not just that you wouldn't maybe see in a longer reading if you're reading chronologically. But if you do a study, you might find, Bethel, that's an interesting place. That's where that's where Jacob sees Jacob's ladder, the ladder of the angels coming up and down from heaven. Bethel is where Bethlehem is, where David is born, and ultimately Jesus. So there's a lot of cool things that you can see in the places in the Bible. So we would encourage you, try to, as you're doing this challenge, find side quests or listen to, we'll try to put out some challenges as we do these videos. Try to do 1 or 2 of those and see where they lead you. See what God shows you through the Bible, because there's a lot of richness in there, but you kind of have to look for it a little bit. You have to seek it out. All right, so now we go on to verse 9, and in this one, Abraham journeyed. So I'm reading the CSB Bible, by the way. So in the CSB, it says, "Then Abraham journeyed by stages to the Negev." And I like this version of it because it just reminds me that our journey with God is in stages. And you can see that even in Abram's life. Like he starts in Ur, and then he goes to Haran, and then he goes to, the land of Canaan and Bethel, and then he's heading towards the Negev, which is actually south and towards, the desert. And so he's on this journey. And as we go on our journey with God, it's not an immediate, like, snap your fingers and you're there. This isn't the supersonic flight, from New York to England where you can get there in 2 hours, right? No, this is a journey, a life journey that Abram's on, and it's the same for us. We're on a life journey, and God will take us there in stages. And that's something important to remember, that sometimes we'll park in a place for a long time, and we might be there for a while. I really liked your, what you said about, is there something that you need to let go or let something die in your life? Like maybe that's what God's waiting for you to let go of that thing that maybe is taking a higher position in your heart than obedience to him, or whatever it is. And other times you might move quickly, where things move fast and are moving faster, but it is a journey and it is in stages. Next, we move on, and the next section now sees us, there's a famine, and we see Abram going into the land of Egypt. And this is where we start to see Abram maybe show a little bit of doubt in God, and we'll explain that here in a minute. So in verse 12 it says, when the Egyptians, so this is Abram talking to his wife, and he says, when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. So please say you are my sister, so it will go well with me because of you, and my life will be spared on your account. And this technically is not a lie, because Abram and Sarah were half brother and half sister. So she is his sister, but she's also his wife. So it's kind of a half truth that they're telling. Instead of advertising that she's his wife, she's just going to say, he's my brother and I'm his sister, which is true. But there's where this kind of maybe shows maybe a little bit of a lack of faith, or maybe it's hard to say. I mean, the Bible doesn't say it's a lack of faith, I guess, so I don't want to overstate that. But maybe there's a little bit of lack of trust in God in this situation, because it doesn't say that God is telling him to make this lie. It just says Abraham's doing it. It doesn't say God is telling him to go to Egypt because there's a famine. He's just going there. And so we don't really know. We don't know if there was any instruction or not, but we do see where God does give positive or absolute instruction. And we know that when that happens, and we don't see that in this scenario. So it's not clear why he thought he had to do this, but I will say it does show maybe that there as it goes on, we find out they get in there and Pharaoh's officials see Sarah and they take her. And so we know maybe there was some justification in this. Maybe Abram saw this happening to other guys and he's like, I don't want this to happen to myself. We don't really know, but kind of what he feared was going to happen, sort of happens. He doesn't get killed, obviously, but she gets taken to Pharaoh to be one of his wives.
Woohoo! Yeah, and if I can interject, verse 11, you didn't mention verse 11. She's very beautiful.
Oh.
And I have to give that shout out to Sarah. She's older as well. She'd be like around 6. I think she's 10 years younger than Abraham, so 60s, 70s at this point, and she's so beautiful that Pharaoh's servants are praising her in front of Pharaoh. But anyways, what I want to talk about is that Sarah has a beautiful submittance to her husband Abram, even though it's the plan he's hatched is less than true. She goes along with it as she places herself under submission to her husband, which places under God's protection. And this is a universal truth in God's kingdom, that when we submit to the authorities above us that God has put there, then we will be blessed and protected. And there's a great quote from the book called Undercover by John Bevere, and it's about being under the cover of God's authority. And it says, the authority in which we walk is directly proportional to our submission to authority. So if you want authority in your life, authority in your prayer life, that's where I've really seen, I've personally seen that grow in my own prayer life, is authority in my prayer life. Like these promises are promised to me and I'm praying with authority. I'm not begging anymore. So there's also, though, we have to submit to authorities even if we think they're wrong, because God told us to. And there's a lot about that in the New Testament as well, and examples of it in the Old Testament. I
mean, that's great, because it's a great perspective from Sarah's perspective, but also from Abraham's. Like, this is his wife, and the Pharaoh's taken her from him, and I mean, I guess you can kind of say, well, why didn't he stand up? Why didn't he say something? Obviously, he's kind of fearing for his life, but still, Abram's not trying to take it into his own hands. He's submitting to the ruling authority of the land, even though what he's doing is clearly wrong. And he lets God deal with it.
That's true.
He lets God protect him through it. And so we see that going into verse 17. Right. It says, verse 17, but the Lord struck Pharaoh and his household with severe plagues because of Abram's wife, Sarai. One of the things that I take away from it is sin and mistreatment of God's people, or any people, because all people are God's people. Sin and mistreatment, even when done in ignorance, can lead to judgment and consequences from the Lord. Right? The Lord, especially if the Lord has made a promise. So the Lord has made a specific promise. And this is where I was talking about, we see God's fulfillment, God's protection kicking in. This is the up in the upper verse, we see, God promising to bless those who bless Abram and curse those who curse him. And this is obviously a curse. I mean, if someone takes your wife, that's not a blessing. So there is a fulfillment in here, because Pharaoh takes Sarai to be his wife, but Abram doesn't fight his own battle to get her back. I mean, he kind of would have a right to, but he probably also knows that he really doesn't have any power over the authorities and the troops. And, Egypt was the superpower of its day. So, but God steps in and God takes care of it. And so God brings a plague on Pharaoh's house. And then at that point, Pharaoh says, well, what have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me? And of course, that's when Abram fesses up and says, yeah, she's my wife, but she's also my sister. And then basically Pharaoh kicks him out, says, get out of here. I don't blame him. I would probably do that too. But at this point, Abram's protected because Pharaoh knows that God is with him. And so instead, in one thing, Pharaoh could have just killed him right then, but Pharaoh's already undergoing the curse part of that promise that God had made. And therefore, God brings about blessing into Abram's life, and we see an enrichment. And so basically he leaves Pharaoh. So Pharaoh had given Abram a bunch of, cattle and riches on behalf of Sarah. So it wasn't just, I'm taking your sister. He's like, I'm taking your sister, but I'll also, give you whatever, rewards as, there were dowries or whatever for wives at that time. So he gave Abram a lot. He didn't take any of that back. Abram got to keep it when he left. And so Abram's enriched by this encounter, which seems like so counterintuitive. Like, well, basically he lied, and his wife went along with it, as you said, right, because she was, being submissive and under authority. And the Pharaoh gets the plague, and Abram gets the blessings and gets away with it all. And anyways, it's just it's one of those examples where we don't, it's easy for us on this side to maybe put judgment on Abram, but I think we have to be cautious in doing that, because God doesn't put judgment on it. God is not saying what he did was right or wrong or whatever. What we see here is that Abram's being protected by God. He's under promise. He's under, well, at this point, the covenant has been made. It's just a word promise, but he's been given a promise by God, and God's promise is holding true. And that promise didn't involve, well, if you do what I say and go where I say to go and do what I say to do and don't do anything more, don't do anything less, then I will give you these blessings. There was no conditional in that. It was just, go to another land and I'm going to bless you. So he went to the other land, and the Lord was blessing him.
Abraham does a similar trick to King Abimelech in Genesis 20. And there as well, the household, King Abimelech's household is the one that receives the judgment, not Abraham. And it's a very interesting chapter. So I recommend that as some of your extra, if you want to do extra reading. Next week is Genesis 22, where Abraham offers his son Isaac on the altar. But really encourage you to read in between there, all of the chapters between 12 and 22 if you want to. If not, read Genesis 15, where Abraham is again promised his son. Genesis 16, Sarah and Hagar. That's also something they pick up from Egypt, is this handmaiden Hagar. And she ends up being a little thorn in the side, really, with how it all goes down. Let you read it. And then Genesis 20, where Abraham, like I said, does this trick again to King Abimelech. And even more reading, there's some great New Testament passages about Abraham. There's Romans 4, all about Abraham and faith. And then, like you mentioned, Hebrews 11, the Hall of Faith.
Yeah. So those are great side quests. Great. I guess you get double Bible challenges this week. So, do a place study, find a place, see what happens at that place, and definitely spend a time, looking at these other passages that Kelly mentioned. But we will see you next week in Genesis 22. That will be our weekly study, where we will be spending most of our time, and we will see Abraham again and what happens with his son Isaac. So hope you have a great week and a blessed week, and we will see you next week.